Hey guys, I'm Miss Haridas and this is the Study Hive, and today we're going to be learning about diffusion. So let's get started. So there are three main points that you want to take away from this lesson. Number one, what is diffusion? Two, how does diffusion work across the cell membranes within your cells in your body? And three, what are the factors that affect the rate of diffusion? So just some keywords that you really want to look out for are words such as diffusion, passive, partially permeable membrane, and concentration gradient. And I'll explain the meanings of them as we go through the lesson. So diffusion is how substances move from one place to another. Now this could happen in your environment or inside your body, and diffusion is just one example of how this happens. There are other examples such as active transport, facilitated diffusion and osmosis, but we'll save that for another lesson, and today we will just look at diffusion. So ever noticed how helium balloons lose their lift? So it's your birthday, you've got beautiful helium balloons, and 1 week later they start to deflate. Why? So let me explain the science. Helium balloons are made up of lots of particles of helium. So if you look at my picture here, I'm drawing lots of particles that represent helium. Now they really want to get away from each other and find space and be independent and roam this world. So what happens is over time they really try to squeeze out of these balloons and go into the atmosphere around them because there's less helium particles. And so over time, that's how helium balloons lose their lift. So how does this relate to diffusion? Well, diffusion is the net movement of a substance down a concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, I've really highlighted the points that are going to give you marks in a GCSE exam. So what does net movement mean? If we take these particles, for example, they're constantly moving around in all directions. However, the net movement means the total overall movement. So you'll find there'll be a shift from these particles over here, generally moving to a lower concentration where there are less of them. Now the second key point, it says it's down a concentration gradient. Now a concentration gradient I can describe or show you is like a slide. Now imagine you're sitting at the top of this slide and you really want to go down this down this concentration gradient to get to the bottom. So you're at a high point over here and you're going to a low point. So diffusion is in the same way. It happens at a high concentration, which is at the top of the slide, and it goes down the concentration gradient, down the slide, for example, to an area of low concentration. So that emphasizes the last point about going from an area where there is a high concentration, to an area where there's little particles, which is a low concentration. Now, just to bear in mind, diffusion really only happens in liquids and gases because they are the particles that can move randomly from place to place. So, how does diffusion link to what happens in our bodies? Now, if you watched my previous cells YouTube video, you would notice that you are made up of trillions of cells, and these cells need to respire. And what is respiration? It's a process that allows you to release energy, and it does so by molecules of oxygen, which is here, trying to get into the cell, and waste molecules like carbon dioxide trying to leave the cell. Now we have a real barrier here, which is the cell membrane of the cell. So let's zoom in to that part of the cell. So we've just looked at the cell membrane. Now the cell membrane you usually learn as just kind of a very simple line. It's partially permeable, which means that it allows some molecules to go, but not all. Now going back to diffusion, the particles you can see here, so this is carbon dioxide, and you can see that it's moving through this cell membrane to an area where there are less carbon dioxide molecules until it reaches an equilibrium, which means it's generally quite even. Now this whole process is passive. Passive means it does not require any energy, and it, again, like emphasized, it will always move from an area where there is a lot of them, a high concentration, to an area where there is little, which is a low concentration. So let's look at the factors that affect diffusion. So the first one is temperature. So let me get my highlighter. Now, when you increase the temperature from a particle level, what happens is the particles will start to gain kinetic energy. So that means they gain movement energy and they start to move a lot more. So you can see here, these particles are moving a lot more. And what that causes is it causes the particle to move to a lower concentration because of diffusion at a faster rate, because all of these particles are going to be moving more. So the way you would phrase that in a GCSE exam is increasing the temperature will increase the amount of kinetic energy, which will mean it will increase the rate, which is the speed of diffusion, so the speed at which it happens. So the second part that we can look at, now this is a little bit beyond the spec, but it's actually quite interesting, and you do learn it at A level, so it means that you would have just heard it before you get there. Now, the mass of a particle. So the mass of a particle, so if you noticed, I've drawn a really big particle over here, which has got a really huge mass, and then I've got another particle which has a lot less mass. Now, naturally, if the mass of the particle is greater, it's going to take a lot longer to get to the other side. So if you increase the mass of a particle, you're going to decrease the rate of diffusion because it's going to take a longer time to get to the side where it's a low concentration. Whereas the smaller particle, the lighter one, is going to get there really quickly. But this one over here is going to take a really long time to get to the low concentration. So the third thing we're going to be looking at, which is a really common example, and it happens a lot in different aspects of your body, so it's very relevant, is surface area. So here I've drawn a little analogy of what happens in your lungs. In your lungs you have these air sacs called alveoli. So the spelling of that, if you're interested, is A-L-V-O-L-I. Now, alveoli are really interesting because they have a large surface area because they're folded. So you can see here, I've really folded the lining of the alveoli. Whereas this one, this lining of, let's say, the alveoli is not very efficient. It doesn't have any foldings. So how does it affect the speed of diffusion? Well, if you look from a particle point of view, there's loads of areas here where these particles can move into the alveoli or in fact leave the alveoli into its surrounding atmosphere or surrounding environment. But if you look at this case, there's only a limited amount of area that these particles can actually move to its surrounding environment. How do we phrase that? So to increase the surface area, you are also increasing the rate of diffusion, the speed at which these particles can move from a high concentration to a low concentration. And the final one that we're going to be looking at is your concentration gradient. So here we go, this one over here. Your concentration gradient, if you look at two examples in my picture. So diffusion, you know, particles have to move from a high concentration to a low one. But they can do this at different speeds. So if, for example, the difference between this high concentration area to this low one is greater, this movement of the particle is going to happen a lot quicker. So because there's a higher concentration here compared to a very little concentration here, the speed at which these particles move will happen quicker. Whereas if you take this example, the difference between this area here and this area is not that much, but you know that particles still need to diffuse from an area of high concentration, which is here, to an area of low. So they will still move in the direction of the low concentration, but they will do so at a slower rate. So you can see here, I just draw less arrows because they're still moving, but happening at a much slower rate. So those are your factors for the rate of diffusion. So just to summarize, so you can sum up this whole topic, is diffusion is all about how substances get transported from one place to another. The official definition, it is the net movement of a substance down a concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now we know this process is a passive process. It does not require any energy, and it takes place in your cell membrane, specifically in your cells, so for processes such as respiration to occur. Now they can also happen in the environment when you spray perfume or the helium balloons or when Coke becomes flat. So these are all examples of diffusion occurring, but we've just looked in more detail about what happens with diffusion in our body. And the final factor that we want to look at is what type of factors affect the rate of diffusion. And the 4 things that you need to know in your spec points for your GCSE exams is the temperature, is the concentration gradient, the surface area, and the advanced one that we just added in, which is really interesting to know, is also the mass of the particles, because different particles have different masses. So thank you for watching this video. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you see, I don't know really what you're supposed to do. Thank you for watching. We really hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you did like it, feel free to leave a comment or subscribe. If you have a friend that might enjoy it or it will help them in their GCSEs, feel free to share this video, and we will see you in the next lesson. Bye!